In 1935, It Happened One Night became the first film to win all 5 major award categories at the Academy Awards: picture, director, actor, actress, and adapted screenplay. A feat that wouldn't be repeated until 1975's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's an extraordinary achievement, especially when you consider that the film was made quickly, cheaply, and without goals of prestige by one of the industry's smaller studios. It's worth asking then, why did this happen? Although it was a clean sweep, such overwhelming success was far from expected or guaranteed, a story best embodied by the nomination of Claudette Colbert, whose eventual win occurred after a scandalous snub that rocked the Academy to its core. In this video, I get into all of it: how It Happened One Night spawned a new genre, why audiences loved it so much, and the Bette Davis win that probably should have been. Émilie Claudette Chauchoin was born in France in 1903. Her family immigrated to the United States when she was just a toddler to look for better employment opportunities. As a teenager living in New York City, she quickly became interested in theater and eventually landed on the Broadway stage. As sound film took off, studios recruited actors from the stage who had actually been trained to use their voices. Enter Colbert, who had, if I do say so myself, a wonderful speaking voice. So in 1928, she signed with Paramount Studios, the soon-to-be home of Marlene Dietrich, Mae West, Tallulah Bankhead, Carole Lombard, Kay Francis, and Miriam Hopkins. Now, if you love classic films, that roster of stars should give you a pretty good sense of the kinds of movies Paramount was making in the late 20s and early 1930s. In the words of Imogen Sarah Smith, in the time before the Hays Code or the set of censorship rules that dictated what could or could not be depicted on screen, Paramount made the sexiest, funniest, riskiest, most glamorous pre-codes of all. It was a studio that specialized in the double entendre, in the suggestive shot of a falling stocking, in the appeal of sin.
I'm sorry you think more of your diamonds than you do of your soul.
I'm sorry you think more of my soul than you do of my diamonds.
Colbert's pre-code Paramount films might not be quite as famous as many of Dietrich's or West's are, but most of them fall right in line with that house style. She could be quite vampy, sometimes overtly lust-driven. This is probably best demonstrated in the epics she did with Cecil B. DeMille. In The Sign of the Cross, she plays villainous Empress Poppaea, who persecutes the chaste and God-loving Christians of ancient Rome. This is the film in which she famously bathes topless in milk, and DeMille dared to add this innuendo.
Take off your clothes. Get in here and tell me all about it.
Her role in DeMille's Cleopatra is similar, although she's given some political gravitas in addition to the Queen of Egypt's sex appeal. Outside of these femme fatale-led epics, Colbert specialized in playing smart, confident women with a stinging sense of humor.
You can't go on all through life trampling on people so ruthlessly. Why not? Because it isn't right. Oh, it's right if you can get away with it.
This era really suits her acting style. These characters wear her easy, relaxed delivery so well. There are 2 standouts for me from this period. Ernst Lubitsch's The Smiling Lieutenant, a musical comedy in which she plays a musician whose lover accidentally convinces a princess that he's in love with her, and Torch Singer, an underrated film which opens with a very frank portrayal of how chorus girls were treated during the Great Depression. She goes from an abandoned single mother to a saucy late-night songstress, whose newfound fame gives her the power she had previously lacked. So by 1934, Colbert was certainly famous and making a ton of money, but she was, to a degree, overshadowed by other actresses at her studio who were doing similar things in better vehicles. She'd have to leave that studio to become a top star. In the early 1930s, Columbia Pictures was not one of the biggest or most prestigious studios in Hollywood. It made lower budget films, didn't own its own theaters for exhibition, and didn't have a huge roster of stars, instead focusing on developing its writers and directors, which is the perfect context for how It Happened One Night got made. Columbia may not have had a lot, but they did have Frank Capra and Robert Riskin, whose collaborations on socially conscious films like American Madness and Lady for a Day drew positive attention to the studio in the early 1930s. The pair continued their partnership with an adaptation of Night Bus, a magazine story by Samuel Hopkins Adams, soon to be known as It Happened One Night. To Capra, the story had the smell of novelty. It was what Stanley Cavell calls in his book Pursuits of Happiness, a comedy of equality. Columbia just needed 2 stars to play the leads. They got Gable from MGM. He'd been demanding at the studio, and Louis B. Mayer offloaded him to Columbia in his free time as kind of punishment, forcing him from MGM's lap of luxury to so-called Poverty Row. Mayer allegedly told the head of Columbia, "I got an actor here who's being a bad boy. I'd like to spank him." Sure, it was tougher to find a female lead. Actresses like Constance Bennett and Myrna Loy turned the offer down, which sucks because I'd really like to see Myrna Loy in this. But the film eventually found its star in Colbert, who had precisely 4 weeks free to tackle the project and absolutely no desire to do it. Columbia being a lesser studio and having not enjoyed working with Capra in 1927's For the Love of Mike. But the studio offered to double her salary and keep her for no more than those 4 weeks. And that was that. Colbert and Gable were set. It Happened One Night opens on Ellie, an heiress arguing with her father. See, Ellie recently eloped against his wishes, and he insists that she annul the marriage to the boring, money-grubbing King Wesley. She refuses and runs away to find Wesley, which becomes national news. She gets on the bus to New York, where she meets Peter, a down-on-his-luck reporter who instantly recognizes her as the missing heiress. Peter offers to help her get all the way to New York in exchange for an exclusive story. She agrees, made bluntly aware by a series of mistakes that she likely doesn't have the street smarts she needs to reach her final destination. Obviously, the two fall in love, and Ellie sprints from the altar at her official wedding to Wesley to find Peter and wed him instead. After the Oscars, Colbert told the New York Times that at first she had no inkling that It Happened One Night would be the hit it eventually became. "I don't think any of us did while we were making it. I thought it was a cute picture that would probably make money because Gable was in it," she said. I think her assumption is a completely reasonable one. It Happened One Night, on paper, didn't read like the kind of film that would become particularly successful in an awards sense. It's a small road movie that follows 2 people on a straightforward journey through less glamorous parts of America. If you think about it in the context of other 1930s Best Picture winners, war epics, biopics, the glitz of show business, it might not seem like anything so special that it would sweep the awards. However, it is precisely for that reason that it felt so noteworthy. Let's take a closer look at the film, starting with the main characters. In his article about the adaptation of It Happened One Night from Night Bus, Sidney Gottlieb notes how Riskin and Capra were advised to change these characters just enough to make them slightly more sympathetic. Screenwriter Miles Connolly told them, "Your girl, don't let her be a brat because she's an heiress, but because she's bored with being an heiress. More sympathetic. And the man, forget that panty-waist painter. He was originally an artist in the original story. Make him a guy we all know and like, maybe a tough, crusading reporter at outs with his pig-headed editor. More sympathetic. And when he meets the spoiled heiress, well, it's the taming of the shrew, but the shrew must be worth taming, and the guy that tames her must be one of us." Riskin and Capra took this advice, ran with it, and that's exactly what we see in this film. Peter became that tough crusading reporter, a salt of the earth kind of guy who shows Ellie how real people live. The audience would be on his side when he taught the poor little rich girl how to properly dunk a donut and shake their heads with him when Ellie simply assumed the bus would wait for her. Ellie is an out-of-touch heiress, but she also values freedom and love. Sure, she commits a social faux pas here and there out of ignorance, but she never scoffs at the quality of her accommodations or looks down on strangers because they aren't of the same economic class as her. She wants to break free of her restrictive cage and find salvation in the everyday life of the average American. This is, after all, a road movie, one that gives us access to innocuous places that rarely get attention in American cinema. Capra wants us to see Ellie walking through a campground, waiting in line for the shower, riding in shitty cars, and eating a bland, no-frills meal. The film doesn't position these scenes as Ellie slumming it or as some embarrassing step down that she can't wait to escape from. On the contrary, it celebrates the dignity of the people they meet and the places they go. The first real joy we see Ellie experience is on the bus, as the passengers sing songs to each other. Soon after, they rally together in hardship to tend to a woman who needs help. Her son bluntly situates the film within the here and now of America in 1934. Riskin and Capra allow Ellie to do the right thing and offer all she has to help the family out. This scene is a good reminder that this film was released at the height of the Great Depression. So when audiences saw a film in which the rich learned a thing or two about what it was like to be regular people, in which money wasn't framed as the most important thing in a person's life, and which toured the everyday parts of the United States in a way that didn't really pity or condescend to the average person, it hit a lot harder. As Ian Scott wrote for the Library of Congress, it happened one night that chimed most with audiences, for they saw on the screen the kind of America they lived in, but they also saw embedded in the characters and situations all the hopes and desires they aspired to as a populace as well. In short, no director and no film could quite match that projection of values and dreams in an era of such harsh realities. The economic context for this film is important, but so is, as I mentioned earlier, the cinematic context. That it happened one night did not traffic in pure escapism or expensive world building made the film feel different from a lot of other films that were up for awards consideration at the time. The New York Times, reflecting on the film's wins after the Academy Awards, said, "What is particularly encouraging about this selection is that It Happened One Night was one of the least pretentious pictures of the year. It's not so long ago that the chief aim of motion picture producers seemed to be to make pictures that were stupendous and colossal in a very literal sense. Those were the days when no picture could be taken seriously, in which a war scene was not enacted on at least a 10-mile front, while 5,000 men swarmed before the camera, whole squadrons of airplanes were wiped out, and entire papier-mâché cities destroyed. Along came It Happened One Night, a picture unheralded by fanfares, which made no attempt to be stupendous or colossal or elaborate, but was simply fresh, spontaneous, and diverting." In 1938, Robert Gessner, a writer and professor at NYU, expanded on that idea, writing, "It Happened One Night broke the artistic stranglehold of the producers who believed that a picture must be about passion in a penthouse in order to make money. It tapped the source of all truly great art. It was about the ordinary, the commonplace, the average. It was about transcontinental buses, bus stations, overnight camps, and hitchhiking." Another thing that struck audiences as new and interesting was the dynamic between Ellie and Peter. I think up until this point, I've painted a rather rosy portrait of their relationship. They're from different worlds and they love each other regardless. Cute. However, if you've seen the film, you know that in reality, their dynamic is rather antagonistic for much of the film. Ellie is annoyed that she needs help and certainly doesn't want to accept it from this exceedingly condescending man who assumes she's just some spoiled idiot. Still, there's a palpable, humorous energy between them. They are combative at first, but they're also fascinated and challenged by each other. You begin to sense that their antagonism masks other feelings. Film scholar Ed Sikov writes, "In the 1930s, a whole genre developed around the perverse idea that love could only be enhanced by aggravation. The thornier the relationship, the better. If a man and woman seem to like each other in the first reel, they are inevitably doomed." Just like Ellie and King Wesley. What we're seeing here is the beginning of screwball comedy, a genre characterized by interactions between members of different economic classes, so the silliness of the rich in films like My Man Godfrey, contentious gender relations, the competitive marriage and awful truth, witticisms.
Every time I think how lucky I am, I feel like screaming.
And wild physical comedy. Although it's largely considered the first screwball, It Happened One Night doesn't quite epitomize the frantic energy for which the genre later became famous. One major factor is that it was written before the implementation of the Hays Code, so there are moments that feel very much like they belong in the pre-code era, notably the sexual tension in this scene and the very obvious suggestion in the film's ending when the barriers separating Ellie and Peter fall physically and metaphorically. The code played a major role in the development of screwball comedy because of how it forced writers and directors to work around restrictions regarding sex. Beginning in July 1934, just a few months after It Happened One Night was released, All films had to follow a strict set of biblically approved guidelines, so sadly, no more tits out for a sapphic bath. As Sikov points out, directors and screenwriters who wanted to make romantic comedies were forced to remove every overt suggestion of physical love from a genre that depended on suggestions and sublimations of physical love. Little wonder, then, that they created comic characters who found themselves doing verbal and physical cartwheels as a way of dealing with frustrated passions. Jane Green continues, "The eccentric behavior of the Screwball couple is often explained via a lay psychoanalytic reading. The sexual energy suppressed under the watchful eye of the censor finds its expression in an acceptable physical and verbal looniness. By this line of reasoning, the wisecracks, cartwheels, pratfalls, and funny expressions of screwball comedy are both a replacement for and symbolic of sexual desire." A few months after the premiere of It Happened One Night, Columbia also released 20th Century, which stars John Barrymore as a controlling director who is on a quest to convince an actress, played by Carole Lombard, also on loan from Paramount, to star in his new play. Of course, the two have a past, and they hate each other, but really they love each other, and chaos ensues. That film better exemplifies that manic, madcap energy we've come to associate with screwball comedy much more than It Happened One Night does. Part of this is thanks to Carole Lombard, who became the queen of the genre. It was an article about her in which the term screwball was first used for these comedies. And so, thanks to Columbia, comedy changed in 1934 when Howard Hawks' 20th Century and Frank Capra's It Happened One Night filtered the Eurocentric brilliance of Ernst Lubitsch's Maurice Chevalier-centric drawing room comedies and the vestiges of slapstick into the American way of life, thereby launching the genre of screwball comedy. Reviews were generally positive, and although it didn't do amazingly at the box office at first, it gradually picked up momentum and eventually ranked among the top 10 grossing movies of the year. As one fan wrote in Motion Picture Magazine, It Happened One Night was the turning point in screen fare that has brought us out of the heavy, dragging dramas we had been getting into an era of delightful, amusing plays. In 1934, there were only 3 acting nominees in each category, sort of, we'll get to it. So for Best Actress, the nominees were Grace Moore in One Night of Love, Norma Shearer in The Barretts of Wimpole Street, and of course, Claudette Colbert. Grace Moore was primarily known as a soprano who sang at the Metropolitan Opera and on Broadway. Much like Colbert, she was lured to Hollywood with the advent of sound, making a few films with MGM before signing a contract with Columbia. One Night of Love was her first film with the studio, and it is very clearly an attempt to write her the perfect star vehicle. It follows an opera singer who goes to Italy and becomes the student of a famous vocal coach who absolutely insists that they cannot fall in love with one another, so obviously guess what happens. Now that sounds interesting, but this film is essentially thin plot filler between renditions of Sempre Libera. Her nomination seemed a reward for her skill as a vocalist more than for her skill as an actress. By bringing opera to the screen, Columbia Pictures again hit the bullseye. This was a feat few others in Hollywood could accomplish, and plenty of people thought she might win. Still, Miss Moore was Miss Moore more than she was anyone else. So as much as she could impress, it was also exactly what everyone expected, and that's not very exciting, is it? Well, it's the early 1930s, so unsurprisingly, Norma Shearer is here. Although she'd made more, let's say, liberated films in the early 1930s, here we see the beginning of her prestige era, composed mostly of costume period dramas that people were meant to take very seriously. In The Barretts of Wimpole Street, she plays Elizabeth Barrett, an aspiring poet whose father controls her and refuses to let her romance with fellow poet Robert Browning thrive. Already the 1929-30 Best Actress winner for her role in The Divorcee, Shearer was a familiar face in the category and the de facto queen of MGM, bolstered by the support of her husband Irving Thalberg, perhaps one of the most famous and innovative producers of this time period. His taste level distinguished MGM as a studio, and consequently influenced what the broader industry considered prestige. The Barretts of Wimpole Street is a great example of this. At the same time, it's also a great example of the kind of film that, by comparison, made It Happened One Night deeply refreshing, attractive, and despite dipping its toe into realism, escapist. Popular as Shearer and Moore were, they didn't have the year Colbert had. In 1934, she starred in not only It Happened One Night, but also 2 other films nominated for Best Picture: Cleopatra, which we already discussed, and Imitation of Life, a drama that explores the notion of racial passing. So within 1 year, she played the nation's favorite comedic heiress, a femme fatale queen, and a woman in a socially conscious drama. A range truly rare to see, not just within 1 year, but sometimes within 1 career in the studio system. So, not to sound shady, but Claudette Colbert really seems like the obvious choice here. That maybe sounds harsh to the Barretts of Wimpole stands out there, but of the 3, she really seems like the only good option. Although, the keywords there are "of the 3, because the story in 1934 wasn't really about who was nominated, it was about who wasn't. Bette Davis took Hollywood by storm with her performance in Of Human Bondage as Mildred, a waitress who marries and takes advantage of a kind doctor. At a time when being glamorous and likable were absolutely the most important things to an actress, Davis willingly transformed herself into a repellent villain, sporting a Cockney English accent and makeup she personally applied to appear ill and downtrodden. She upended the idea of what a movie star could be. Now, I made a whole video about this, so I don't want to retread too much of this information. I'll leave a link below. But essentially, people were so blown away by this performance that when she didn't get nominated, it was a scandal of epic proportions. One can only imagine what it might have been like if Twitter had existed. Actually, we kind of can, because film magazines were filled with angry letters from exasperated fans complaining about the Academy's choices. What are you fans seeing Claudette Colbert to rave about anyway? To me, she's a very ordinary mortal with no spark whatever of greatness or distinction or even personality. I thought the annual Academy Awards were given for the best acting of the year. Evidently not. That role in It Happened One Night did not require any great acting. Now take the role Bette Davis played in Of Human Bondage. That took honest-to-goodness acting. These criticisms shook the Academy so hard that they felt obligated to respond. They couldn't add a nominee, so they decided to allow write-in votes. So there'd be the 3 official nominees, and then a place where you could vote for whoever you want. Davis was expected to bring in a big haul of those votes, as was Myrna Loy, who was also egregiously snubbed for her performance in The Thin Man. Davis and Loy would have been great nominees because they had very compelling narratives. Both had essentially revamped their careers overnight. Davis changing types from just another blonde fashion girly to a bad bitch character actress, and Loy from an evil exotic to a light comic perfect wife. They were comforting indications that people don't necessarily have to stagnate in movies. And yet, zilch. Of course, neither would win despite their momentum. The outrage over Davis's turn basically guaranteed that she'd win the Oscar next year. It could have been for reading the phone book, but it turned out to be for a pale imitation of Mildred in Dangerous. Loy would be less lucky, not once earning an actual nomination for the rest of her career. So in summary, Claudette Colbert received momentum from the popularity and novelty of the film, from the lack of competition by her fellow nominees, from the diversity and quality of her overall work that year, and from what was probably too much effort for people to actually write Bette Davis on their ballots. For what it's worth, Claudette Colbert also suspected that Bette Davis would take home the award that evening. She was about to depart on a train to New York when she was informed that she won. She ran back to the ceremony dressed in her traveling outfit, accepted her Oscar, and then went straight back to the train, which had been held for her, unlike the bus in It Happened One Night. And so she helped It Happened One Night break new ground at the Academy Awards by winning Best Actress. The good news was that with this film, she was able to resituate her career as a comedic actress. Paramount, as you'll recall, was known for its risque material, but with the implementation of the Hays Code, that would have to change. Some actresses were unable to convincingly pivot away from those kinds of characters, or at least it took them some time to do so. Colbert had an immediate route forward, and while she did appear in straight dramas throughout the rest of her career, she's probably best known for comedies that follow in the footsteps of It Happened One Night, like The Palm Beach Story and Bluebeard's Eighth Wife. Although quite popular and well compensated by Paramount, Colbert never quite reached the same heights in her career again as she did with It Happened One Night. She had a chance though. She was offered the Margot Channing role in All About Eve, but had to pull out due to a back injury. As much controversy surrounded the Best Actress category in 1934, I think this win both rightly marks a turning point in American comedy and honors the laid-back, naturalistic style that made her pre-code films so appealing. One of the fun things about making my Best Actress videos is thinking about who I might vote for in these races. I think we all know I'm a Betty write-in voter for this one. But it's fun putting yourself in the voter's shoes and thinking about why or why not something is awards-worthy and what does being awards-worthy even mean. We've all wondered what it would be like to have our own awards shows, and Patrick Willems actually made it happen. Right now, you can watch his very well-produced awards show that includes a much wider range of awards: Best Scene, Best Needle Drop, Best Episode, and more. It's cool to see an alternative take on awards shows that really takes into account the variety of mediums that entertain us. Patrick uploaded a version of this on YouTube, but did you know there's an extended cut with several extra minutes of content? That version is exclusive to viewers right now on Nebula. As you may already know, I recently joined the Nebula family, which means that all of the videos I've made for YouTube are currently streaming ad-free, and everything I make in the future will be too. A big reason I was so excited to join Nebula is because it's creator-founded and creator-led, meaning the folks behind this service really care about nurturing content that creators are excited to make, not just things that we think the mysterious YouTube algorithm will favor. That means we can experiment, dig into niche topics, and really push ourselves to the next level. Another reason Nebula is great, they prioritize the audience's experience, not the experience that's most lucrative for the company. That's why everything on Nebula is ad and algorithm free. You won't get any pre-roll ads, there won't be 12 interruptions in the middle of a single video. Everything on Nebula is paid for with subscriptions. So when you sign up, you support my channel as well as an entire community of creators tremendously. Working with Nebula has already given me a ton of ideas for where to take the channel next, so I hope you consider signing up. Right now, they have an amazing offer going where you can get an annual plan for just $30. That's only $2.50 a month for exclusive content from creators you're probably already watching. And as a hint, I'm planning on putting some exclusive stuff out there next month. So it's a fantastic deal. If you're interested, click the link in my description to sign up and support the channel. Thank you.